What if Bruce Springsteen recorded with the Ramones? That's the scenario we'll be considering on this week's What If, How, When, Why. Hi, my name is Morgan Brown, and every Monday I upload a new What If video to my YouTube channel. The idea with these is that each week I pick a different popular song and imagine an alternative universe in which some change of circumstances causes that song to come out completely different from the version that we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I happen to have to hand in order to bring that alternative version of the song to life. So the song I chose this week was Hungry Heart by Bruce Springsteen, and I tried to reimagine that as if Springsteen had recorded with the Ramones as his backing band. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster. I'll be the first to admit that I wasn't always a Springsteen believer, and I did come to the boss relatively late in life. I mean, his music's been around for my entire life. It was always there in the background, but somehow it just never really connected with me. I think the first time I actively tried to listen to it was when I was a kid, first really getting into music. I borrowed the cassette of Born in the USA from my local library. At the time, I was really kind of just getting into metal and heavy rock and just couldn't get into the boss at all. It was like, there are guitars on this, but they're not loud enough, they're not distorted enough. There aren't enough guitar solos. What are all these keyboards and saxophones? So at the time I just wrote it off, gave up, didn't really try listening to him again in earnest until quite a few years later, by which point I got into punk rock, and then I found everything to just be a bit overblown, a bit too overproduced. I wanted something raw and more direct, and Springsteen just didn't seem to be delivering that. So at that point I kind of thought, it's just not for me. I don't think I'm ever going to get into this guy. And just didn't really try again for a long time. I think what finally swayed me was a good many years later getting a Steve Earle record that had him covering State Trooper. And I think I just listened to the song before I looked at the credits on the record and realised it was a Springsteen song. I was just thinking, this is a fantastic song. Saw that it was by Bruce Springsteen, and then looked at where that came from, discovered that it was from this album called Nebraska, which I had never heard of before. Eventually managed to dig up a cheap copy of that, and that was kind of a total revelation for me, because all that big elaborate production that had been off-putting to me years earlier was nowhere to be heard on there. It was just really lo-fi, stripped down recording, and these beautiful, bleak, haunting songs. It's just astonishing. I mean, by that point I was listening to things like Townes Van Zandt and Elliott Smith, and it was very much the Springsteen album for people who like Townes Van Zandt and Elliott Smith, so absolutely loved that. And then I think somehow getting into his songwriting from that was kind of the key to appreciating all the other stuff, because then when I heard some of the more produced full band records, I was actually properly listening to the songs rather than just being put off by the overall effect. So once I got into him through Nebraska, even the most sort of obnoxiously 80s sounding stuff like Born in the USA or Tunnel of Love, I was just appreciating the songs, and now I don't even mind the production. So yeah, definitely thankful to Steve Earle for opening my eyes and ears a little bit there. But yeah, after Nebraska, the second album that I bought to continue my journey into the world of Bruce Springsteen was The River, and that kind of really sealed the deal for me, because it's just such a great album. It has elements of so many of the different things that you want to hear from a Springsteen record. It's got the haunting ballads, but it's got the gritty rockers, it's got the kind of daft, goofy pop songs as well. I know there are people, like with most famous rock double albums, there are people who will say, it's overindulgent, there's just too much on it, it would have been better as a single album. There are always people who have those theories, whether it's about that or about the White Album or Blonde on Blonde or whatever, but I wouldn't want to lose a single thing from The River. I think it's awesome. I love the fact that it was actually originally conceived as a single album, which was going to be called The Ties That Bind. I gather that they actually basically finished that album. It was sequenced and mixed back in 1979, but Springsteen just listened to it and felt like it still needed more, so they just kept recording and recording and recording, and ended up with apparently something daft like 50 songs. And so it could have been even longer, but the listing they ended up with was absolutely perfect. And of course that includes this week's song Hungry Heart, which, as everyone who's delved a little bit into rock trivia knows, he was initially planning to give away to the Ramones. The story was he met Joey Ramone somewhere in New Jersey back in 79, and they got on pretty well and were just chatting, and Joey suggested that, oh, maybe you could write a song for the Ramones, and I guess he'd just been working on this song, thought, well, it's a kind of fun, upbeat, simple song that would probably work really well for the Ramones, so he was planning to give it to them. But then Springsteen's manager and producer John Landau intervened, because he was like, this song sounds like a hit, but I guess by that point you'd already kind of given Blinded by the Light to Manfred Mann's Earth Band, which is fantastic, and Patti Smith had a hit with Because the Night, and then the Pointer Sisters had a hit with Fire. I guess he was just kind of thinking, this guy just keeps giving away these absolute gold songs, so John Landau intervenes and prevents him from letting the Ramones have it, and obviously a good choice, because it does end up being a huge hit, even though you could argue that he didn't really need to keep hold of it, because he obviously had no shortage of songs. But it's funny, because when I first heard that story, I was thinking about Hungry Heart and thinking, it doesn't sound that much like a Ramones song. It's kind of hard to imagine what the Ramones would have done with that. But then, of course, when you think of the time frame that it came out in, it coincides with the Ramones making End of the Century their fourth album, which is the one that they did with Phil Spector. And when you place it in that context, it's actually kind of perfect. It's a really interesting album, End of the Century. I mean, I'm a huge Ramones fan, but End of the Century catches them at a really interesting transitional point. I guess they'd had their first three albums, self-titled, Leave Home and Rocket to Russia, which are all utterly perfect punk rock records. They've totally defined a genre, solidified the band's sound, and just absolutely magnificent records. But I guess in terms of sales, maybe not setting the world alight. So on the fourth album, Road to Ruin, you see a few changes starting to come into effect. Tommy, the drummer, who wasn't super keen on touring anyway, steps back into a production role, and they get Marky Ramone in, who's a bit more of a conventional drummer, maybe just gives him a little bit more of a mainstream sound, maybe has a little bit more versatility as a musician as well. And that album, you start to see them trying to branch out into a few different things. Still plenty of just straight ahead, heads down punk, but there's also things like their cover of Needles and Pins by the Searchers, which is quite a nice, delicate pop song. Don't Come Close, which is almost verging into country territory. So you can definitely sense on that record that they're aiming towards something that's going to be a little bit more commercially successful, but then they really take the plunge with End of the Century, and it's a strange mix. Not always entirely successful, but definitely an interesting listen. I think it was most specifically Joey's dream to work with Phil Spector. Having grown up on 60s girl group pop, I think Joey was always the member of the band most inclined towards the poppier end of things. Definitely absolutely revered those classic early to mid 60s Spector records. And I think the feeling was mutual. I think Phil Spector didn't necessarily want to work with the Ramones as a band, but he really did want to work with Joey. The rest of the band were much less enamoured with Spector, and in their various accounts, they've all given some pretty negative stories about that experience, including obviously all the old tales of Spector pulling guns on them and holding them hostage. I think at one point Dee Dee denied having played on the record at all, although everyone else contradicts this and suggests that maybe Dee Dee was just so out of it that he didn't remember playing on the album. But you end up with this odd mixture of Ramones trademarks and Phil Spector trademarks kind of clashing up against each other, and sometimes melding and sometimes really failing to. So there's still stuff that sounds like the old punk Ramones, although generally with like odd little bits of production touches that seem superfluous and a bit jarring. And then there are other bits that just sound like a Phil Spector record with Joey Ramone singing. Most obviously Baby I Love You, which remains their biggest hit in the UK. Everyone apart from Joey hated it, but I mean, it doesn't sound like the Ramones. It's not really a Ramones record. I think Joey's actually the only member of the band on that one, but it's still great. But then there are points where the two styles do actually gel really well. Like, do you remember Rock and Roll Radio, I think, is just an unbelievable record. And that's, to me, the perfect 50-50 blend of what the Ramones were doing and what Phil Spector brought to the table. And how that wasn't the biggest hit in the world, I don't know. It seems crazy to me. It's just a perfect pop record. And when you hear things like that, I think that's where you can hear how Hungry Heart with that Spector production and the Ramones actually could have worked really well. I think it would have slotted onto that album absolutely beautifully. And there are always going to be some punks who will look back on those turn of the 80s Ramones albums and be dismissive of them, say they're a sellout. But I don't know. I think the idea of punk selling out wasn't quite as firmly entrenched at that time as maybe it is now. I don't think the Ramones ever claimed to be any sort of band that was deeply committed to remaining underground for their careers. I mean, they wanted to be a pop act. They were just always a little bit too weird to quite manage it. I think all those albums where they were trying for that commercial breakthrough have got something great to offer. I mean, loads of people slag off Pleasant Dreams, which followed End of the Century, mainly because Graham Gouldman produced it, of 10cc, but that's got some great songs too. I mean, The KKK Took My Baby Away is another song that should have been the biggest hit in the world. We Want the Airwaves, All Quiet on the Eastern Front, great songs. And Subterranean Jungle that followed that, I mean, that's starting to edge back more towards the harder sound. I think you can sense Johnny asserting his influence a little bit more on that, but there's still plenty of great fun bubblegum moments on that as well. They cover a little bit of soul, stuff like that. So I think if you've ever dismissed that chunk of the Ramones' back catalogue, it's something well worth going and digging through. I mean, they're not the most consistent albums of the band's career, but every single one of them's got some pure gold on it and definitely well worth a listen. But yeah, that brings me back round to this week's alternative universe scenario. So really, up to a point, I'm kind of basing it on real world events, but then just deviating. So in my alternative universe, it's like in ours, Joey and Bruce have met. There's the suggestion of Springsteen writing a Ramones song. He's got Hungry Heart and is going to give that to them, but then John Landau doesn't want him to do that. But in this universe, in this timeline, Springsteen's not happy with this idea at all, and he digs his heels in a little bit and eventually arrives at a compromise. He's like, okay, I get that you don't want me to give the song to the Ramones to do on their record, but if you won't let me do that, then what I want to do is I want the Ramones to come over and I want them to back me up on my version of it on my record. And John Landau isn't too happy about this. He doesn't want to upset the standard formula they've got going on there with the E Street Band, but Bruce just really digs his heels in it, remains really stubborn, won't back down on it. So eventually Landau just has to concede, so they make the arrangements and the Ramones are happy to do this. It's a really fun opportunity for them, so cut this version of the song. Although they've been building up to working with Phil Spector, Springsteen decides he doesn't want any of the kind of popped up version of the Ramones. He wants the straight down the line punk rock Ramones, so they cut it very much in that first three albums Ramones style. And just as a little concession to John Landau, he does allow him to pretty up slightly. He gets Danny Federici to come in and overdub a little bit of organ on there, and also brings in Flo and Eddie of the Turtles to just do a couple of bits of backing vocals as well, just to give it that little bit of extra commercial edge. And the song's a total smash, so Bruce is completely vindicated in this decision. Big hit for him, and also wins over a bunch of punk fans to the Springsteen cause as well, and at the same time helps to give the Ramones that commercial breakthrough that their own label, Sire Records, has been urging them to push for as well. So it's a win-win all round. So my own attempts to make a Ramones-ifying Hungry Heart were pretty fun. I've seen a few other people on the internet trying to do Hungry Heart in the style of the Ramones. Normally, if I'm aware that it's an idea that other people have already tried, I'll back off from things because I want to try and do things that are a bit original. But I thought this was a bit different because it was actually Springsteen's vocal over a Ramones backing. And also, I kind of feel like the other versions that are out there, they're sort of Hungry Heart in a pop punk style, but there's nothing specifically Ramones about them. So I wanted to make sure this one really kind of nailed what I think the Ramones sound is. The first step was, as ever, just getting the isolated vocal, dropping it into GarageBand and singing it up to the grid. Sped it up quite a lot as well because obviously I wanted that early Ramones pace. Next stage was just putting some drums on. I know that in the time frame of Hungry Heart it would have been Marky Ramone era Ramones, but I really wanted to go for that Tommy drum style, so that's what I did. Super minimalist, single kick and snare beats, eighth notes on the hi-hat, no fills, just incredibly simple, austere drumming style that is just a total defining feature of those early Ramones records. Popped some bass on as well. Again, super minimal, root notes, decent chunky old Ampeg bass sound, all downstrokes, aggressive, simple, done. And then guitar-wise, there are actually probably a few more guitars than you might think. I did consider briefly going for the first album Ramones things and just having a single guitar track panned to one side and then the bass panned to the other side, but I wanted something a bit fuller sounding than that. So I've actually got, I think, 5 guitars on there in total. There are 2 main rhythm guitars, just with a good crunchy kind of overdrive, pan left and right, just playing straight ahead bar A chords, downstroke 8th notes all the way through. If you're going for an old school Ramones thing, you don't want to have anything too fancy on there. You don't want extra melodies or leads or anything. So all I wanted to do was just emphasize some rhythmic things and emphasize some dynamics. So on the choruses, I've got an extra pair of rhythm guitars with a slightly different sound, panned to a slightly different place, and they're just playing a slightly different rhythm as well that just beefs up the sound a bit on the choruses and adds a little bit of a different rhythmic push in there too. And then there's a final guitar which has a slightly cleaner sound with a bit more reverb on, and that's just doing a rhythmic push on a couple of notes at strategic points. And I totally copped that idea from Sheena is a Punk Rocker, which has a guitar with a really similar sound doing exactly the same thing. So ultimately it's all just a big wall of distorted guitar, but there are different things coming in and dropping out to just give it some dynamics and some slightly different rhythmic things. And then that was about it really. The only other thing I added was a couple of extra percussive elements that you do hear on Ramones tracks. So we've got certain sections, a tambourine just emphasizing the backbeat, and then on other sections you've just got some hand claps emphasizing the same thing, and I think I bring them both in at the end over the fade out. Obviously I couldn't get rid of the bits of keyboard and backing vocals that were on the isolated vocal track that I've got, but I figured, you know, maybe Springsteen would have allowed Danny Federici in to do some overdubs, and having Flo and Eddie on a Ramone track is not too far off the mark. I mean, they did eventually turn up on Poison Heart from Mondo Bizarro, so it did happen eventually. Oh, the one other thing that I almost completely forgot to mention, I really want to have a 1, 2, 3, 4 count in, because, you know, that's a standard Ramones thing. Could have used a DD one, but I kind of wanted to have Springsteen doing it, so I took the count from the middle of Born to Run, ran it through a stem splitter to take off the band sound, so it's actually the Born to Run count that's at the start of the track there as well. And then for the video, start off by just finding a decent clip of Springsteen in the 80s doing the song. It's not actually from 1980, I think it's an 84, 85-ish clip, but that's fine. Sync that up to the track, so he's looking fairly frantic there on stage, but that's kind of fun. And then blended it in with some Ramones performance clips, which I think are taken from the It's Live Rainbow concert, which is great footage. And then just to add a bit more context to what might have happened with this Springsteen-Ramones collaboration, mocked up a few concert posters to just pop Springsteen in the middle of some New York punk scenarios as well, just to suggest that maybe he's there mixing it up in the New York punk scene at the time as well. And that was about it. Again, kept it pretty simple, but I feel like it actually all works together pretty well. So hope you enjoyed it. It was a nice one for me to do, because although a late convert, I do love a bit of Springsteen and absolutely worship the Ramones, so bringing the two things together and trying to recreate that Ramones sound was tremendously enjoyable for me. So hope you enjoyed it too. Let me know what you think down in the comments, and if you did enjoy it, please like and subscribe. That's always great. If there's anything else that you'd like to see me do in coming weeks and months, any artists you'd like me to investigate, any genres you'd like me to try my hand at, or any songs you'd like me to have a go at, please do let me know. I'm always open to your suggestions. But otherwise, that's all from me for this week, so thanks very much indeed for watching, and I will see you next time.